Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Leaders from 21 Pacific economies are gathering this week in Lima, Peru for the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Conference. Since its establishment in 1989, APEC has become the premier forum for facilitating economic growth, cooperation, trade, and investment in the Asia-Pacific region. However, as global conditions evolve, the Asia-Pacific is navigating significant economic challenges like moderate growth, heightened political uncertainty, and trade protectionism. What is the focus of this year's APEC Forum? How can members eliminate internal and external interference to better promote economic cooperation? And what progress has been made in building a China-like community with a shared future over the past decade? Join us for this dialogue special, APEC Moment, Think Tank Roundtable, live from Beijing. I'm Xu Qinduo. Joining me first are Diego Macera, Director of the Peruvian Institute of Economics and board member of the Peruvian Central Reserve Bank, Wang Huiyao, President of the Center for China and Globalization and former Counselor of China State Council, Warwick Powell, Senior Fellow at the Taihe Institute, and Jeff Moon, President of the China Moon Strategies and former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China. Well, welcome to the dialogue. Let's take a look first, starting with Diego. Peru is the hosting country, so with the theme of this year's APEC Forum is Empower, Include, and Grow. So tell me your interpretation of the theme.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's glad for me. I'm very glad to be here. We have been struggling in Latin America for the last decade, I would say, with sluggish growth. In Peru in particular, we're getting close to a decade of 2 to 3%, which is pretty insufficient for including more people, for India modern economy, for making middle class more robust, for lowering poverty rates. Peru did manage to, in the previous decade, starting 2004 approximately, to reduce poverty in close to 30 percentage points. That was an amazing feat. But since for the last years, especially after COVID, political crisis and slow economic growth have really hampered the expectations and the mood around here. So we do need a new start, and really think that cooperation with larger economies, cooperation with China, we're talking about a representative of Canada, the US are coming here, could really provide new investment, could provide new opportunities. That's part of the hope that we're trying to build around here.
Well, economic growth and investment and more trade. Huiyao, we know that Chinese President Xi Jinping is attending this APEC summit, of course, and paying a state visit to Peru before his visit to Brazil, where we are obviously attending the G20 conference. Tell us, what's the Chinese expectation out of this summit?
Well, I think this is a very significant time, actually. We're seeing huge changes taking place in the world, of course, also this year. I mean, China, of course, has always upheld the solidarity and, of course, also the economic globalization with a number of countries. And it's definitely, the countries like Latin America, countries like Africa, and also all the Asian Pacific countries are really the key partners. So I think what President Xi visit to Peru and Brazil will send a strong message. China still values great cooperation with those Latin American countries. But also, China is their largest trading partner for over a decade now. So, and also given the time we're having now, we're at a crossroad. Shall we uphold free trade? Shall we uphold multilateralism? Shall we really become a protectionist? I mean, there's a lot of issues on the tables that world leaders, APEC leaders, need to sort out. So I think President Xi will emphasize, global cooperation, multilateralism, and of course, China's cooperation as usual, to give the assurance that China will continue to support Latin America and uphold free trade and globalization.
You mentioned Latin America, of course, besides APEC, is also a bilateral relationship here. As President Xi is visiting the two countries there. So how do you look at this year marks the 10th anniversary of the, the building of a community with a shared future between China, Latin America, and the Caribbean. So how do you look at this efforts, joint efforts of, I would say, building a closer relationship between the two sides?
Well, it's actually so important. As a matter of fact, I think that China, become a largest trading partner for many of our Latin American countries. And then so, we realize we benefit from this cooperation. We actually work together. So this is so important, given that we are having, recession, threat is still there. We got economic slowing down in many places. So how can we sustain this cooperation and build a community of shared future? That is exactly what we are doing, is to strengthen the cooperation, strengthen free trade, strengthen the dialogue, and strengthen the communication. So by personally, President Xi visiting two Latin American countries this time to show the importance of China attaches that to this Latin American community, that we can really find a way to work together for the benefit of the mankind. And then particularly Latin America is rising, is also a large continent. We need to work together also with Asia Pacific countries, with China, and of course, that this 10 years of anniversary of our cooperation will continue to be strong. And that's exactly China is promoting economic globalization versus, over secularization or over, democracy versus autocracy, that kind of division. We want to inclusive to really make Latin American and many other global South countries to really pursue the economic development and prosperity and peace on that.
Well, Warwick, sitting in Australia, if you look at China's cooperation with the regional countries, in Latin America, so we have a figure, the bilateral trade stands at some 500 billion. How do you compare that, globally? Where does it stand?
Look, it's a small part of global trade, of course, but what that tells us is that there is a very significant growth opportunity, and that growth opportunity can only be realised through cooperation. Trade is something that involves two parties, and it can only involve the two parties when there are complementarities on the one hand, and when both parties recognise that the exchange brings benefits to each other. Importantly, the APEC framework and the ethos of APEC over the course of the last 3 decades has always been committed to punching through the barriers to openness and trade and tackling the headwinds towards that inhibit the ability for countries to gain the benefits of trade. China has been an important trading partner, as you've noted, but it's more than that. It's an enabler, and it enables participation and growth and the expansion of economic independence for participating countries by supporting the development of critical infrastructure. And that, I think, dovetails very, very nicely with one of the key themes of this year's APEC conference.
Jeff, if you look at this relationship, well, of course, before his arrival, actually, Chinese President Xi Jinping published an article highlighting the relationship between China and Peru, for example. And Peru is the first country which signed a free trade deal with China, and also one of the first countries basically participating in the Belt and Road Initiative. China has been the largest trading partner of Peru, and also largest export market for the last 10 years. So, Jeff, how do you look at the relationship? Trade, the booming of the trade over the past 10 years between China and Peru, is that representative of China's ties with the regional countries?
Well, I think this is just a reflection of China's economic diplomacy, and APEC is one of the venues where their economic diplomacy is conducted. And China is a global trading power. It has increased its activity in Latin America, so it's entirely natural that trade would expand with Peru and with other countries in the area. I think that it's done that through, I know that there are free trade agreements, and there are many APEC countries that have those free trade agreements. The United States, for example, has free trade agreements with all of the countries along the Pacific coast of North America. So this is all good. This is trading activity that is hopefully promoting economic development.
Well, Diego, briefly, how important is the trade relationship, to your country and also to China?
No, it's incredibly important. China is our first, as you were mentioning, China is our first trading partner, has been so for the last few years. This is also the case for most countries in Latin America. And increasingly, it's also being the main source of foreign direct investment here. So it started especially in the mining sector, but it is now also investing heavily on energy and in infrastructure. The most important project for the last years being the Port of Chancay. But there's talks about investment also in railways and highways. So it could become a very, very valuable player in foreign direct investment in the next few years.
You mentioned Chancay Port, which is a flagship project of the Belt and Road Initiative. So tell us, there's some coverage about this report. People are talking about cutting this, the travel distance of the time it takes to about 10 or more than 10 days from Peru to China. It seems important to Peru, of course, but also to regional countries like Brazil.
Yeah, it's really the talk of the year here. It's one of the most important topics talked around. So what we're seeing is to shorten the span from a trip from Lima to Shanghai from 35 days to somewhere closer to 23. And for the ships to be able to travel directly from one coast to the other of the Pacific instead of having to go the usual route that they have, that is going north, stopping in Central America or North America, and then crossing over the ocean. It could be a direct route, and that's a huge advantage for us. Now we're thinking Peru is a very important exporter of agricultural products, but China as a reception market is still lagging behind a little bit. So we sell 10 times more agricultural products to the U.S. than we do to China, for example. Now we expect to change that also with the port. It's going to be, of course, heavy on mining. Our main exports for China are mining related, especially copper. But here, so we're talking about the other countries. This should be a hub not only for Peru, but we're thinking the thought is to be also for Chile, for Ecuador, for Colombia, for Brazil, and perhaps for Bolivia to be also a port of entry. Not to a poor connection with the rest with Asia. Some countries are worried, of course, that some of the cargo that's going through their ports could be deviated to Chancay, and that's also a concern, for example, that is being going around in the Chilean press for the last few months.
Okay, some competition, of course, there. Now, looking at this, let's say beyond the relationship of import and export of minerals, agricultural products, what's the next stage for bilateral, economic relationship, Diego? Are we looking at like renewable technologies or telecommunications? What's the potential?
Yeah, so as I was mentioning, beyond trade, investment is very important here, and we're really hoping to have investment that translates into more technology and for in the local markets. There is some interest on special economic area around the port of Chancay. This is being debated in Congress as we speak. The port is being inaugurated today. But there's a lot of interest in having an industrial area around it where we can have some of the big Chinese companies that perhaps have expressed some interest, the Huawei, the BYD, and in order to have a hub here from where to export to the rest of the region. So that is something that is being debated as we speak here. It's a topic of a lot of interest. And furthermore, there are opportunities, we hope, also in a relationship that is also based in infrastructure, in investment for infrastructure. So for us, railroad, for example, could be a game changer in a country that is geographically difficult as Peru is. And also, there is some talk about investments in water management that will be extremely important for us. The coast of Peru is a desert, so that's also an area that we're interested. And in general, transfer of technology is what we're looking at for the next few years.
For the next few years, the transfer of technologies. Well, now also joining me now is Ottaviano Canuto, Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South and former Vice President of the World Bank. Welcome to the show, Ottaviano. And we are talking about this relationship between China and Latin American countries, of course. We're talking about this port. Speak of this APEC, with the focus of economic and trade. What we have now, from one analysis, it says that economic and geopolitical factors are slowing growth in APEC region. For example, the region's growth rate is expected to moderate from 3.5% in 2024 to 3.1% next year, and then further slow to 2.7% in the medium term. What do you make of it?
I would say, well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. The major concern is what might come with the new government in the United States, on whether Mr. Trump will carry on with the pledge that he's made along his campaign in hiking tariffs, especially tariffs on China, the 60% on all imports, but also 10 to 20% to all the other countries. And there is a major concern that the protectionist wave by the US will also try to cover the so-called connector countries. That is to say, those countries that have managed to increase and substitute the Chinese, among other reasons, because of investment by Chinese transfers of global value chains from China, the final parts of the value chains, to these connector countries. And that includes Mexico, Vietnam, and so on. And there is a fear that if the protectionist move is broad enough, it will also affect these countries. But also, it's important. Of course, we all know China is already preparing to react to an eventual revival of this trade war by enacting its own ways, its own weapons. But the problem is that ultimately one cannot deny that the protectionist wave will also tend to affect at the margin the growth of China. And as aptly discussed by you guys up to now, China has become the major trade partner for the whole South America, including my own country, Brazil, and so on. So whatever happens to the Chinese economic growth also impacts these countries. And that's the major fear. Naturally, under those circumstances, investors tend to be a little bit more, let's say, risk averse, and they postpone investments and so on. I guess the geopolitical framework and the environment of trade disputes is the major risk, let's say, affecting all the countries of the APEC, the U.S. itself, but also the other countries.
Warwick, you are nodding your head. Do you share the concern that the new government in the U.S. will have a huge impact on global trade, in particular in this region?
Well, it will certainly have an impact. The impact that it will have will not be as big as perhaps it might have been 20 years ago, when the United States was a much more significant participant in the global economy. In saying that, I'm not suggesting, of course, that the US economy is small by any standards, but in relative terms, it is no longer as important a trading partner for most countries as it once was. And so the United States crab walking away from open trade whilst it will be inconvenient, and in some respects, and in certainly some sectors and for some industries, will have some impact, the global trading regime and relationships, I believe, will be in a position now to adjust and adopt and adapt to the changing environment. The greatest disappointment, I think, in terms of the trading regime, is that the WTO is now no longer as functional a regime as it once was to enable trading parties to raise disputes and resolve them. The United States has, since the first Trump administration, made it impossible for appellate judges to be appointed, thereby limiting the ability of the WTO to hear and resolve disputes. Countries are finding ways around this, and of course, forums like APEC create the informal environment in which countries can at least discuss alternatives when the more formal mechanisms have been stymied. So the United States, in summary, can of course have an impact. It is unfortunate and to some extent disruptive should they pull out or significantly withdraw from the global trading environment, but it's certainly not the death of globalization. And in fact, the rest of the world will simply move on because the rest of the world understands the benefits that open trade and open investment flows can actually bring.
Now we have Christine Suzanne Jin, Director of the Gentala Institute Indonesia. Welcome to the show, Christine. So I also want to have your opinion. Of course, countries around the world are responding to the victory of Donald Trump. He's known for his being a tariff man. Of course, his mantra of America first. What's the response from Indonesia, for example, or countries in the region, Asia Pacific?
I think many of the countries in the region are still very much concerned with the tendency for protectionism. And we are actually questioning about the the coming President Trump's America's First 2.0 program, because as we know, during Trump's earlier period, his tendency to disregard multilateral framework and also not put Southeast Asia or ASEAN within their radar has been raising a lot of concerns. And I think with the whole protectionism, upcoming, the continued geopolitics, and also a lot the continuations of conflicts and wars in either in Ukraine, in the Middle East, especially with regard to the humanitarian disaster in Gaza, has continued to increase the anxiety in the region. And for Indonesia, now that we have a new president, it's been quite evident that the president is very committed to maintain open regionalism and also to uphold some of the concern from the global south. And I think his attendance in APEC is going to raise a lot of these questions and also to promote sort of a more open regionalism, and hoping that the new leadership in the United States can sort of like conform as well.
Well, Jeff, a major factor, of course, will affect APEC and all global trade. As we mentioned, President-elect Trump and his policies here. Carlos Vasquez, proving ambassador, who chairs the APEC senior officials group, said consensus remained possible among the member economies despite difficult and complex process. But he also predicts protectionist barriers are going to be even larger in the next few years. Do you agree?
Yes, I do, unfortunately. In many discussions, I think protectionism, at least for purposes of this conversation, equals tariffs. But it's worth remembering the reason why those tariffs are being introduced in the United States. That's because of protectionism overseas by countries that promised market access but didn't deliver, that have been engaged in state-sponsored technology theft, forced technology transfer, overcapacity, predatory pricing. All of those protectionist problems are increasing, and I think that they will into the future. Now, I'm not a supporter of President Trump. I didn't vote for him. I won't defend him, but I think that he will move down this path of increasing tariffs in order to try to level the playing field. And I think that is going to be fraught with danger. With respect to APEC, however, I don't think that any of this needs to affect the work of APEC. I've participated in APEC both as a U.S. official and as a business executive representing an American company. And I think commentators that haven't participated in APEC tend to think of APEC as the summit. But APEC is a lot more than that. APEC, there are lots of bilateral meetings, and you've seen some of that between the U.S. and China, but it also is unique because it involves the business community. There are 270 working groups that work year-round, culminating in the summit, and that is an invaluable opportunity for businessmen to liaise with officials, for people to share best practices, for relationships to be developed, and those relationships endure beyond the passage of individual leaders of countries that come and go. So APEC as a large institution is important and valuable without regard to these protectionist tendencies that we're now going to see in the near term.
But will, in any sense, I mean, protectionist practice like tariffs, basically on every country around the world, I don't know what excuse that is, if not a protectionist practice there. But anyway, the 60% on the Chinese goods and the services, as I talked about, what will be China's response? What China is seeking for the second term of Donald Trump?
I think China can do much more. Of course, President Trump actually elected. He said, he levied the taxes on Chinese import EVs, but he welcomed Chinese investment. I just saw the CEO of KATL, President Zheng, said he wants to invest in the U.S. So I hope that maybe like what happened in the 90s when Japanese automobile export so much, and then eventually they manufacture there. So we could do that. But another thing I can do, I think President Trump is, this term, I think he probably will be more pragmatic. He have done the phase 1, but because of the COVID, we couldn't finish that. But let's continue phase 2, phase 3. Furthermore, I think he needs China to help him on making a peace president. He claimed he's going to end the war in 24 hours or before his inauguration.
Right.
So that can be done. But I think, largely, basically, is that Latin American that would see this APEC holding in Peru and G20 in Brazil is a really out loud voice that we still want multilateralism. If U.S. is not playing active role, Latin American, China, and many global South countries will do. So this is really good gathering and to send that message.
Yeah. Otto Viano, what's your look at say the future prospect next 4 years under Donald Trump? Other countries, the rest of the world, will work together and continue the globalization?
Yes, but let me say 2 things, if I may. First, there is a change of scope, probably, in the trade confrontation between the U.S. and China, and in the sense that if one looks at what President Biden has done, it has been something more focused on some sectors. Of course, the reason, the excuse is security and so on. But the fact of the matter is that the approach taken by the U.S. during Biden's government has been closer to the one proclaimed by the Europeans, which is de-risking, is focused on some segments because of the concern and so on. Now, with Mr. Trump, the most appropriate word should be decoupling, which is quite different from de-risking. That's one point. Second, I also am with those who believe that there will be no, let's say, deglobalization, full deglobalization, but we are about to see the emergence of a parallel globalization.
And with that, we come to the end for today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.